And sometimes it's just best to almost look at it like you do in your kitchen at home. You could have a nice big sink bowl, but if it's full of dishes and you don't have space to put more dirty dishes and then set the clean dishes to dry, it's unproductive.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
On this episode of Beyond Clean, we speak with Jereme Oldt, VP of Sales and Customer Relations at TBJ Incorporated, and this season 17 dedicated to equipment. We're on the back end of the 8 episodes. And so, Hank, I'd like to talk a little bit about what Jereme's going to be bringing to the table today, which is a conversation around sinks and just how much more complex that design has been getting over recent years.
Well, Justin, as a company like ours called Beyond Clean, we've got a soft spot in our hearts for anything that actually helps to clean. And there is no piece of equipment in the entire sterile processing workflow that is more critical and integral to that cleaning process than these sinks. I'm looking forward to going deep into the sinks, wide into the sinks, all those kind of analogies and metaphors. Like, we're going to get all up in the sink conversation today because of its importance, but also to dig behind the assumptions out there about, what is a good sink, or is there anything that we can do more than what we've already done? I think that for years it's kind of been like, that's that, piece of metal in the corner and it's got a sprayer and that's all we need. Well, I think it's going to be a little more complicated than that.
All right, we're going to be right back after a short break. Jereme Oldt, VP of Sales and Customer Relations at TBJ Incorporated. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, well, joining us in the studio today is Jereme Oldt, the VP of Sales and Customer Relations at TBJ Incorporated. Jereme, welcome to the show.
Hi, Hank. Thank you.
So on this episode, we are going to be talking all things sinks. It's called a salute to sinks. And in a category of season 17, we're talking about everything in the department that's driving the main equipment, right? So like when you think sterile processing, what are those big equipment pieces that are critical to us getting the job done of fighting dirty every instrument every time? And of course, sinks are right up there at the top as one of the most important things that we can have. But before we jump into the meat of the interview, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself? Who you are, where you came from, how you got involved in this portion of the industry?
Yeah, I'm actually probably one of the oddballs at this point. I've been with TBJ for either my 18th or 19th year. I started with them right out of college doing primarily life sciences equipment, and we've kind of evolved as a company in that time and, have a pretty heavy focus on sterile processing at this point. Kind of thought it was probably something I was just getting my feet wet with out of school. And then here I am 18, 19 years later. I'm excited to still be here and somebody that's kept a job in the same place for that long.
Yeah. Well, I'm telling you, it's definitely a new thing. I was just talking to someone on the phone yesterday about our industry and how much turnover there is across the board in the hospital setting, but also on the vendor side. So yeah, that's definitely something to be proud of. And I think, speaks to the company culture as well. So on this sync question, we'd like to start these episodes this season kind of setting the table for folks that maybe they're new technicians, maybe they're technicians that have been in the industry for a long time, but just kind of take this type of equipment for granted. But if you were to explain the importance and just the place of these sinks in the sterile processing workflow, like when it's needed, why it's needed. How would you kind of set the stage on this particular topic?
Yeah, well, it's actually been pretty cool over kind of seeing this evolve. And me, myself, never really worked in a formal hospital setting. Just the attention that these have been getting, even over, the last 5 to 6 years, in how sinks in general have evolved from more like kitchen counter sinks or more restaurant commercial sinks into equipment that is very specific to sterile processing departments, larger sink bowls themselves, counter space, ergonomics. It is just fascinating to see how this is evolving and changing and being better utilized and more brought into the pre-cleaning practices in general.
I want to ask you a follow-up on that, because you've got experience outside of just the sterile processing industry when it comes to sinks, right? Like you've sold into, it sounds like, the restaurant industry as well.
We do very little in the restaurant industry, a lot more in research and life sciences, which we call it, which is university research programs, pharmaceutical research programs, things like that. But it's all somewhat similarly related.
And so what are those different kind of sink requirements? Because you mentioned like sterile processing is kind of taking on a life of its own, and that is growing more and more complex. Are you not seeing that on the research life sciences side?
It is. It was actually probably a little bit earlier on the research side, especially with things like ergonomics, where, on the research side, they wanted their equipment to be multifunctional, accommodate different sizes of users, provide safer working environments for users. And that is definitely evolving into the hospital industry and the sterile processing industry now. I mean, not that it probably wasn't already, very dominant in places like ORs, but maybe really underutilized or lacking when it came to, the backroom processes, the sterile processing, not the glamorous surgeons and OR departments.
I think that's probably an understatement. It was definitely ignored, for a long time. Even as late as, 2009, when I started in the industry, there were already some like mechanical lifting of the sinks, all the way back in 2009, but it was still rare. Nowadays, you go into departments, and that's a pretty common thing. We'll talk about, some more of those tweaks on the ergonomic side, but even still today, you do see a lot of departments that have sinks that are suboptimal for a number of different reasons. You referred to a couple of those, and we'll dig into those here in a minute too. But that's interesting that it kind of started first on that research side of things. But yeah, we're definitely excited to be getting some better designed and equipped sinks in those workspaces, because we spend so much time back there. Like you can literally, depending on your shift and your assignment, be spending 8 hours a day at this one piece of equipment, not really moving about a couple feet, here and there. So you want it to be as well designed for the human interaction as possible. In looking at the variations for sterile processing sinks in this industry, and in talking to your customers out there in the industry, what are those kind of general variations or different types of sinks that folks are installing today or that you're supporting today in the field?
Well, a lot of what we're seeing is actually kind of being defined by some of the things like, groups like SGNA or AAMI guidelines, things like that. So we're definitely evolving into stuff where we're seeing a lot more triple bowl setups and basically user functionality and optimizing the space that they have there to be able to give as much staging area, counter space, and then the actual size of the sink bowls to comfortably accommodate all of the different instrumentation, whether it is just, your basic instrumentation, or even getting to things like the robotics Da Vinci instrumentation that require much larger sink bowls, but still require the same pre-cleaning that any generic surgical instrument would require.
I feel like you've been either reading my mail or reading my mind right now, because that comment about, bariatric instruments and robotic instruments in particular is a huge gap historically in how we've requested and worked around the sync question, because you're right. There's a lot of challenges out there with the uptick in robotics and these very long instruments, these very long trays, and then you walk in to your sink with this manufacturer's IFU that says that these devices need to be soaked and need to be manual cleaned, and you literally cannot get that tray into that sink bowl. And that's interesting that you're seeing that at a wide scale, it sounds like, around the industry today, that folks are saying, hey, if we're going to be doing these cases, we need these kinds of sinks that are designed to keep them. What about as you transition kind of to the ambulatory surgery side of the industry? Are there any other, like, space constraints you kind of alluded to are already in play in the large hospitals? It's even magnified that much more in the ambulatory surgery center, but are they still as in tune with these sync requirements, or is there still education to do? What you kind of read on that?
I think that sometimes the smaller surgery centers are actually maybe a little more educated than larger hospitals. That's not to say that they have the means or the space, but they do tend to really try to maximize that small area that they have, or the constrained budgets that they have, to stay up to date on the best practices and the best equipment. So I think I think that they're just on par with major hospitals and everything. And I think they are doing a really nice job of trying to keep up with, like I said, the resources and the minimal amount of space that they do have.
I guess in order to survive in that setting, you're forced to be creative. Like, you're so space constrained, you're so budget constrained. It's like, this is a skill set that you must have in order to be hired here. So that plays out in that regards. Okay. On the sync design part of this, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to a sync manufacturer on this episode is really all those other things. And we talked about, the sync bowls that you mentioned. I don't know if you use the phrase like shelf space, but, that is often kind of an afterthought because so much focus has been put on the bowls, on the size, and like how many bay sinks, like 3 bay sinks, right? All that emphasis has been put on there from groups such as AAMI and guidelines out there, ST79. But there's not a lot of discussion around, hey, do we have space to stage instruments in this manual cleaning process? So how do you approach that practical challenge? Because we've got to put trays somewhere in the cleaning process with how you're designing those sinks and, working with customers to make sure that that's customized appropriately.
Yeah. And you're totally right. There is not a lot of forethought on that, and a ton of afterthought once people start using the actual sinks and realize that maybe they didn't have the counter space or the staging area that they needed. Some people really do think about that up front, probably more based on their current layout and experiences. Something that we try to do is actually maximize the overall length or footprint that they have available for a sink, and then do recommend things as simple as even like an under-counter storage shelf that isn't to be utilized for instrument staging or anything like that, but it gets other things off the countertop, like detergent bottles, for maybe enzymatic dosing, something like that, that if we can get that under the counter, it opens up that little bit of counter space that they may have there. And sometimes it's just best to almost look at it like you do in your kitchen at home. You could have a nice big sink bowl, but if it's full of dishes and you don't have space to put more dirty dishes and then set the clean dishes to dry, it's unproductive.
So let's talk about, I don't know if it's adequate to call these bells and whistles, but let's talk about some of the accessories to sinks outside of the bowl, right? So like if I'm looking at designing a sink or maybe renovating existing sink, et cetera, what are all those extra things that sterile processing users today are taking a look at or asking on that customer side, from y'all to create and design in your manufacturing process?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of very unique accessories and options available today. a lot of them are more geared towards kind of aiding the technician in actually performing their pre-cleaning procedures, from anything from an automatic sink bowl fill that would allow somebody to simply push a button and have a sink bowl fill without having to stand there and monitor it, allowing them to free up and get their next case ready or whatever the case may be, to things like integrated ultrasonics, agitators, flushing systems. There's a lot of great stuff out there. I think there's still a lot of development to occur here because, with technology also comes issues. So simplicity right now, I think, is the key, but whatever those features are, whatever we can do to make them as user-friendly as possible and basically as reliable as possible, so that technicians don't have downtime if something doesn't work, if a controller doesn't work, if something like as simple as a push button doesn't work. We want to avoid those things, but there are just excellent features that I think are going to continue to evolve and really aid in this whole process.
Yeah, I guess you're right. The more moving parts there are and the more electronic buttons that can fail, the higher the risk becomes of that downtime. And these things are not like they're banged around, right? Like that's the whole purpose of these things. Like there's a heavy metal every single day all around these pieces of equipment. So they've got to be quite durable. And there's water all over the place by design. So, to that again, like want to get into kind of the innovator mindset, from y'all side. How do you approach all of that challenge with the water, with the heavy like wear and tear? Like, how does that impact how you put your sinks together with intention for it to stand the test?
Yeah, well, fortunately for us, coming from, like I said earlier, that research or life sciences background, we were very accustomed to almost overbuilding equipment, if you will. We use primarily heavy gauge medical grade stainless steel materials in everything we do. But when it comes to accessories and features, we really like to stay on the more simple side of things. The more complex things get, the more chances there are for issues to happen. And we've just found that the more simple that we can keep them, things like a simple timer or a simple push button really go a long way in preventing downtime, as opposed to things like a PLC controller or something like that, it's like sitting down at your computer. If it needs an update, it's going to delay you in getting your job done for the day. Mm-hmm. So the more basic mechanics that we can have in a unit, the better, because it really eliminates downtime. We also try to be redundant with what we do as well. So if you do have something like an autofill system on a sink, if for some reason that goes down, you still have a manual faucet there to be able to manually fill that sink bowl. It's inconvenienced your day, but it has not delayed your day or really changed your day and what you're able to accomplish.
I want to go back to your comment about the timer, because that caught my attention. Like, I know that's kind of a little thing in the grand scheme of things, but if you look at all of these manufacturers' cleaning instructions and IFUs, that timing function is there across the board. It's almost universal. If they're telling you to do something at the sink, they're telling you how long to do it. And I was shocked when I began consulting a couple of years ago in all these different decontamination areas that I went into. There was no timer. There was no clock that was visible. Like maybe there's a clock on the wall, like over around the corner, but nobody was like starting a cleaning process. Let's just say like flushing a device, then walking around the corner and checking out the second hand and then walking back after 30 seconds to go, finish a job. Like, it just was not happening. So part of like on our side, what we started providing for resources was around that timing piece and just saying, hey, if you're going to have a sink and you're going to be cleaning compliantly, you need some kind of timer function. If it's integrated to the sink, like you said, or even just like an accessory timer that's added on, but there's no way that you can be compliant without that. And potentially, because you're doing multiple different stages of cleaning at the same time with different devices in different bays, you will likely need more than one timer to make sure that you're covering all that. So I just wanted to highlight, like, that is a very, very critical accessory. Like, that's not a bell and whistle. Like, I would really put that up there, with critical. Like you really should not be installing a sink today without some kind of timing function.
Yes, you're completely right.
So let's transition here to some best practices in regards to training. So I'm kind of thinking about the user training side of things as you're doing sink installs and you've got everyone around you in the decontamination department and they're looking at you to say, hey, like, how do we use this new widget? What are some best practices that you would want to share about how to conduct that training or what you have found really successful in making sure that folks can use the equipment as it was designed to be used?
Yeah, kind of back to simplicity again. And this was even, it was complicated, especially over the last couple of years during the pandemic with not being able to do a lot of in-person trainings. So we got quite good at actually doing them virtually. And we found that actually the more simple something is, the easier it is to not just train on a person, but to train on virtually.
Yeah, surprisingly, huh? If you keep it simple, it's easier to train and understand.
Exactly. And to just make things, it seems commonplace, but to put the controller for an appliance right beside or an accessory right beside that accessory, it makes it self-explanatory, if you will. Instead of having one main control panel for a whole sink, if you kind of separate them and have them individual for each of those options, it really makes it very user-friendly, which ultimately makes the training very easy. I've also found, most of the technicians are extremely responsive, very inquisitive, and they're as interested in this piece of equipment or this sink as they would be getting a new car or something like that. They're very excited to put this into use. So I would say really engage with the technicians and listen to the questions that they have during a training really helps. It gets everybody very clear on the best practices of that sink, of the best way to utilize the setup that you have there. And, even me, I'm going to learn something new at the end of that training too.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the movable parts, and maybe even not all just the movable parts, but what are some of the preventive maintenance concerns or considerations, I guess I should say, that folks should be thinking about in managing whatever kind of sink they have? Like, what are the things that every user should know needs to be done on a regular basis to extend the life of this piece of equipment?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Cleaning, simply cleaning, whether it be performed multiple times a day or at the end of the day or in between shifts, whatever the case, to just do a thorough rinse of all of your stainless steel surfaces and then a dry wipe down of it. It extends the life of stainless steel material significantly. Enzymatics are not necessarily harsh to stainless steel, but when they're combined with regular, domestic or city tap water, there are minerals and things like that in that water that eventually want to bond to other surfaces, whether it be the surgical instruments or the material used in the sink in general, which can cause pitting and degradation of that material and shorten the lifespan of it. So that is what I recommend the best or the most, is to just simply thoroughly clean and dry all your surfaces at least daily. Everything else with at least our sinks anyway, we make so it doesn't require actually any user preventative maintenance. That's not to say that you might not have to, have a facilities crew or something come in and tighten some things or check some things periodically, but we try to keep that out of the actual technician's hands. Let them do their jobs and then not have to worry about doing anything other than cleaning up their work area at the end of the day.
That's a great point about the long-term impact of enzymatics and that tap water on the stainless, because like we know, we're washing surgical instruments that are also stainless steel, but they're not in contact all day long, every single day with that enzymatic. Like they go through maybe an hour or so of cleaning, but then they're dried and they're sterilized and they're sitting on a shelf somewhere. But the sink's just continual exposure to the chemicals into that tap. So that's a great point of getting it off on a regular basis and then keeping it dry. So that's great feedback. I want to throw out here too, this is not a PM requirement, but going back to what you said about the auto dosing, because that's big. Like that's another thing that is really getting adopted across the industry. Everyone's moving to that auto dosing for good reason, because it's easy to scale, it's standardized. However, if you're preparing for Joint Commission, everybody listening, just make sure if you're using auto dosing that you're verifying it and validating that auto doser is working correctly. So you want to be doing that on a regular basis. If it's weekly, if it's monthly, to get a measuring cup and, hit the button to make sure that it's dosing appropriate to what it is. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Jereme, or not, but I wanted to throw that out there.
That is actually a great point. And they do. Most of the enzymatic dosing systems out there now, almost all of them are very easy to calibrate and test. Like you said, you simply get a graduated cylinder or a measuring cup, and you could test that, even daily if you wanted to. And some of them now even give you a report with it where they'll log it, every dose that's done out of there, and confirming that it was the right amount of enzymatic. And also, just to add to that, water temperature as well. There's a lot of evolution in enzymatics these days, and I don't think they're as stringent as what they once were with the water temperature that they must be used at, but it is also critical to make sure that when you're dosing that your water temperature is matching what is recommended from your enzymatic detergent.
That's such an interesting dynamic too, because if you're manufacturing sinks and on the innovation side, you don't control the chemical side, but you got to be aware of what's happening on the chemical side, because if there are those temperature control requirements or, water requirements or dosing requirements or anything else, like you've got to integrate that pretty quickly to make sure that everyone's compliant if there's like a big change in chemicals that happens out there. So I know we are getting close to the end of the time, but I do have a couple more questions I'm going to kind of pepper at you here. The first one is on design and install. If you were to give a couple of tips, or maybe just one tip, I don't know, on like what are those biggest mistakes that people make in installing or designing their sink area? Like what do you want to caution people against, or what do you want them to think about?
Consider your egress into your building and room. It happens almost once a year to where somebody is in a rush for, a piece of equipment, whether they have a Joint Commission or something coming up, or something has to be changed, or a renovation time period or whatever. They get the sink, they move forward with it and everything, and then it becomes a logistical nightmare to try to get it actually into the building and room. These sinks are growing. I mean, no more is a sink 5 or 6 foot long. They are typically 10 to 12 feet long now. That does definitely bring up issues of egress.
Okay, that's a great point. Yeah, just getting it in, like not even like opening the door, because that's where I thought you were going with it. Is like they get it installed and then they can't open the door, can't get case carts in, which also might be a challenge. But you're talking about just getting it in the room. That's a great point. And then can you list a couple of things that, folks just may not know about sinks? Like, is there anything out there that folks maybe take for granted or assume that you want to kind of bust that misconception or that myth?
Yeah, not all sinks are created equal. And I think that it is very important now for whether it be technicians or managers to look at sinks specific to sterile processing. A kitchen sink, a commercial kitchen sink, is not an acceptable appliance for a sterile processing department, in my opinion. And, although they may be less costly, more readily available, and a quick solution, they are not going to hold up to the day-to-day usage that a sterile processing sink does. And I'm not really saying that more from an abuse side, but more from an efficiency side, a workflow standpoint, to be able to utilize a piece of equipment the way it is supposed to be used.
That's a great point. And it gets us away from this historic industry confusion around, sterile processing being glorified dishwashers. Like I've had conversations about that in the past, and a lot of folks have, and I'm not, just to do a complete tangent here, I don't like the immediate pushback against the term glorified dishwashers, because I think dishwashers do have a glorious job themselves. Like who would want to eat in a hospital without some great dishwashers cleaning all those utensils? So they have a place. It's very, very important, but they are not sterile processing. And to your point, we shouldn't and we can't be using the same equipment if we've got completely different goals and challenges in mind, like removing bioburden with enzymatic at certain temperatures and everything else is way different than just removing debris from plates and cups and utensils. So I want to give that little shout out there. Last question here, I promise. And you kind of alluded to a little bit, and I almost jumped around, but I wanted to save this till the end if we could. What's the future like? It's getting more complex. You've already told us that. These units are getting larger. If you could look down, the next 5-10 years into the future of sinks, what's in store for us in the industry?
Wow. If I knew that, I'd be already trying to take that business route. But
yeah, there you go.
No, I really do think that, some more semi-automated features, more things like, an automatic fill and dosing. I think that they are going to evolve and even become a little bit more user-friendly, a little more accurate, and likely coupled more into technology to where even a manager can see from their office or wherever, right on their computer exactly what's going on at a sink. They can double check, make sure the water temperature is good in it, that the right amount of enzymatics are going in, all of that. I don't see any giant leaps and bounds here, but maybe just easier to monitor, easier to check, and, the continued progression of user friendliness.
If I remember, I'm going to check back in with you in about 5 or 10 years, and we'll see if your guess is correct or if you're holding anything back that you want to surprise us with in a couple of years, too. Really appreciate your time today, Jereme. You've done a terrific job. And I knew that you could talk for 30 minutes on sinks, but I wanted the whole industry to see, this topic is deep and broad, and we still just scratched the surface. So, yeah, thanks for a great interview today.
Yeah, and thank you, Hank. I really enjoyed it.
That was Jereme Oldt, VP of Sales and Customer Relations at TBJ Incorporated. And Hank, I think we've taken sinks for granted for a really long time. And this interview really detailed well just how much more complex the design is getting with sinks, and really to match the complex needs of the industries and the devices that just continue to get more advanced.
That's right, Justin. I asked him at the end there, what the next 5-10 years looks like. And it was kind of a hard question for him because a lot of the innovation in this space is dependent on what's happening outside in the industry, like what's happening with the instruments, what size are these instruments, what's happening with the chemicals. All of this stuff is kind of trying to create that airplane on the way down, to use that metaphor. Like we're already in the air, everything's changing around us, and now we need these sinks to work in all these different scenarios. So it's kind of taking it for granted, as you said, I think, in the past, but we're starting to see how integrated of a nexus this piece of equipment is for everything else that's happening in healthcare, in surgery, and in sterile processing in particular.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode. But as a reminder, you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. We're also available on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. We've got bonus content. And guess what? It's also associated with the best way to listen to Beyond Clean, which is downloading our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And we'd really love it while you're there downloading if you gave the app a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to us here at the show. And speaking of feedback, if you have some topics that you'd like us to cover, or maybe you have a recommendation on a future guest, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.